So welcome everyone to our next AI talk. Our guest is Ayça Atabey, who's from a totally different field. She's studying law. Our relationship with the field of law, started last year when Leyla Hoca and I intersected, and we signed this cooperation agreement between the Bilgi IT Law Institute and the KUIS AI Center. There's actually many interesting intersections of AI and law that I'm sure Ayça will inform us in more detail later on. But from my limited perspective, the thing that brought me to Leyla Hoca's door was the data protection laws, personal privacy laws, etc. Laws, data, as you know, is basically the fuel of our technology in AI, and there's a lot of regulation around who can use what data and how it can be distributed, etc. So that was one thing that brought me to Leyla Hoca, and Leyla Hoca wanted to get some information about the new AI technologies, where they're going, how we're going to regulate them in the future, etc. So we realized that we need each other, and we need researchers like Ayça to lead the way if we're going to have a good future with these emerging AI technologies, where they actually serve people rather than enslave people, I should say. So I'm going to briefly introduce Ayça and revert to her presentation. Ayça is a researcher at Bilgi IT Law Institute right now and a research consultant at UN Women. She's a graduate of Robert College, Durham University, and Istanbul Bilgi University. And she's currently enrolled as a PhD candidate at Edinburgh University. Her PhD research focuses on fairness and designing privacy-respecting technologies for vulnerable data subjects. Her work particularly involves the intersection between data protection, AI, and human-computer interaction. She's also a research assistant for the Digital Futures Commission at Five Right Foundation in the UK. Ayça, thank you very much for coming to our little seminar series, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deniz Hocam, for your great introduction. Today I will be talking about assistive technologies particularly, but because it's a very, very broad topic, and like there are a lot of things to cover in terms of data protection there and vulnerable data subjects. I decided to focus on emotional AI and assistive technologies that children use in the context of education. But actually anything like, especially the fairness principle and other principles that I will be referring to, the logic there, the reasons that I'll be talking about, we could apply to all assistive technologies in some way, and especially particularly for the elderly and like medical devices, maybe assistive technologies used in the medical context, let's say. So just wanted to make this clear in the beginning before I start. Yes, and about value-sensitive design. Deniz Hocam, you talked about data protection laws. They are like very much intersecting and very much relevant in the context of assistive technologies. But also what I'm doing, what I'll be talking about today, and what I'm looking into in my research, in my PhD research as well, is the intersection between value-sensitive design in human-computer interaction field and law data protection laws. And this is especially relevant in the engineering side, computer side, like technical side, let's say, as well, because actually there are a lot of issues, as most of you might know, about like biases in many contexts, especially like gender, age-based, any kind of vulnerability factors that come into the way when applying technologies or using technologies, especially that are used by the vulnerable groups such as children. So let me start with the emotional AI, and actually let me describe it first and why actually I say assistive technology for that. And then I will move to the fairness concept, and then we are going to look at these things from an interdisciplinary perspective actually, but mostly focusing on fairness and how actually we could operationalize it so that it could, if I might, work in practice. And if you could have a formula, we are going to decide maybe that together. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me, like on the chat. I could answer them later or during the presentation as well. So yeah. And the main thing is, another thing that I want to really want to underscore the importance is that emotions are understood as universal. And when we talk about in law, when we talk about fairness principle, when we talk about other principles as well in the GDPR, or actually like many data protection laws that are like in the world, in different parts of the world, in Central Asia, in the Western Balkans, and like anywhere, actually they are very much they very much address one data subject. Although there are some principles that are particularly addressing vulnerable data subjects, usually the laws are written for a typical data subject, which we call average data subject. There's no definition for it whatsoever in any part of the world, which is a problem that I'll be mentioning today as well. But this is particularly important when we talk about fairness and how it could be applied, how it could be interpreted in the context of assistive technologies. Because as you can probably imagine, like all of us are different, everyone is different, groups of people are different. When we say children, there are different vulnerable groups of children as well. And fairness is a very much abstract concept, and actually it could depend depending on the values, depending on the culture, depending on everything. So things become more and more like harder actually when we think about them like in practice. So yeah, about the universal aspect of emotions, I would say. So a key element of the classical view is that emotions are universal, as I said. And research findings supporting this view began like years ago, specifically on 6 basic emotions from the tribe members. Interpretation, and therefore in the very different parts of the world, in New Guinea, and then there are other research in Africa as well. And after looking at the tribe members, as I said, there were like 6 basic emotions. And then a surge of similar research followed with similar findings, and thus building what looked like a sound evidence for the base for the universality of the emotions. However, new wave of psychology, I will be also talking about a little bit of like psychology field today. As I said, it will be like a interdisciplinary perspectives, like from many disciplines. Psychology and neuroscience research, they cast significant doubt on the validity of the previous body of research, and especially with a recent meta-analysis concluding that the ways people express emotion can vary significantly. This is what we see particularly with children. And let me mention children with learning disabilities, who are very much overlooked in our country as well, in Turkey as well. But recent research, and there are a lot of emphasis on the assistive technologies used by children with learning disabilities, especially in the UK and in the US. Especially in the last like 10 years or so. So it's very, very interesting to look at children with learning disabilities and their use of emotional AI and how they benefit from these, and how actually the fairness principle, or like fairness, is used in the context of emotional AI driven assistive technologies there. So the differences that I was talking about could depend on the facial expressions, any reactions that children are giving, not only children with learning disabilities, but any kind of, any children, not kind of, but any children, any groups of children, let's say. But the recent findings show that actually, well, definitely everyone could have different kind of reactions to how they feel, how they find things. And this is especially also relevant in the context of paying attention, which I will be talking about shortly, as children with like ADHD, for instance, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And because teachers, especially in the UK currently, there are a lot of technologies, a lot of assistive technologies are being used at school, at home as well, but particularly at school. Education data, let's say, or anonymized data, which is argued, I'm sure most of you know, it's a huge debate topic, whether it doesn't fall under the GDPR. It doesn't, the GDPR data protection, personal data protection laws, they don't cover anonymized data, but there are a lot of ways actually anonymized data, when they brought together, it's possible to identify a person, a child, which
Ayça,
had,
may I ask a question?
of course.
Okay, so can you, to make this more concrete in our minds, can you give some examples of these technologies?
Of course, for example, about the, I can give one, for instance, in context of education, is what you're asking, or like anything.
Right. So, you know, as far as I understand, what you're going to discuss is basically in the context of these developing technologies, how to protect the rights of, you know,
children, for instance. I'm giving
children. So it would be nice to have some concrete examples to visualize.
Of course. I'm sorry. Yeah, of course. For instance, very much widely used technology right now in the UK, for instance, schools, as I said, for children with learning disabilities, so that actually teachers or like people who work at the school, especially teachers, they can follow and they can see how a child is feeling, how he or she is doing, how much attention she or he is paying, and looking at the, like looking at some patterns or some reactions. I mean, like in the classrooms, for example, it could be through an app as well, and especially they use iPads, let's say, and there is an app used at school. And actually, and how like the way child interact with that technology doesn't have to be an app as well. Teacher actually, the technology itself brings a report for the teacher, says that actually the child pays more attention. This week was like that. He or she pays more attention or less attention. She was sad. So maybe an appointment with a counseling office in the school could be beneficial. So things like that. And especially a lot of data is collected from vulnerable children because they're like in a more vulnerable position, and depression rates are higher there. So these technologies actually are used, some of them, of course, to predict and also to see how a child is doing, both in terms of education, so helping them with this is why it's called, I think, not assistive technology, assisting them in the educational context, but also in context a little bit health, although it's very interesting that actually in the UK education data definition does not include anything related to health data, and the ICO makes that very clear. But actually looking at this example, for instance, when a technology tells a teacher about how a child is feeling and whether he or she it's likely that he or she could be in depression, could be feeling bad. These are actually very much related things that relate to mental health. And these are shared with the school, the teacher, and then the Department for Education, blah, blah, as well. So any kind of technology here, but I'm talking about especially in education context.
Right. So these technologies are, for example, the webcam on the iPad or the computer the child is using, or how do they tell how the child is feeling, through which what kind of
sensor? The webcam is being used too, but the technologies that there are I'm not sure if I should be giving names, but there are specific assistive technologies apps that are particularly purchased by the schools to be used for children with learning disabilities. They read for them, they check their expression, they track how they're doing week to week. But yes, they use webcam, they use like voice recognition, or
Okay. I guess we should make when you say assistive technologies, sort of part of what we understand from that are technologies that assist children with their learning. But I would classify the types of technologies that you're mentioning in another category, maybe a subcategory of assistive technologies. These are more sort of teacher spying technologies almost, right? So these are not actually directly helping the child learn, but helping the teacher get more information about the child.
Exactly. And a great point that you made, because this is very relevant to whether a technology is necessary to be used, so that a child, in the context of right for a child to exercise or enjoy his or her right to education. And when we look at from the perspective that you just said, actually they're, as you said, maybe spying technologies, and they're assisting, but assisting teachers as well. So maybe they're not necessary, other ways could be used as well. So why being necessary is very important, because that changes everything regarding to the lawful basis that a controller, the company or the school is, an organization, let's say, must choose before processing data, before using a technology. And if something is necessary to do in the context of processing personal data, then, as I said, it makes a huge change. Then they can justify their processing, and they can use this technology actually more and more as it's being used now. And so yeah, but I'm not sure about the technical size of it, but this is how actually it is bold. Yes, indeed. Right.
So are you going to argue that this data should not be shared at all, or it should only be shared with the teacher but not the larger educational community? Or so where do we draw this line? I think in China, for example, they're using these technologies with almost no limit and spying on all the kids, and that's not making a lot of people in the West very happy. Where do we want to draw the line? I mean, before technology, teachers would actually look at the faces of the children and probably understand how they're feeling and doing in class, right? So I guess we don't want to ban that. That would be a bit going too far. But
definitely not. But looking back, like a technology or an app, creating a report on how a child, after sharing that with the parent as well, and how a child feels, looking at the face expression, the hours he or she is working, doing the homework, maybe at night, or like looking at a lot of things after tracking, and creating a profile for that child, and then actually making assumptions, deriving from what the technology can see. So that could be that's I think something something different maybe. But before that, because you asked, for example, just another example came to my mind. Because I talked a lot about children with learning disabilities, but for example, autism as well. So children with autism, it's quite challenging for them to communicate emotionally. Actually, I just not that any names or any particular technology that I'm talking about, but when we talk about assistive technology in the context of education children, this is another kind of assistive technology for which there are a lot of research on. So emotion AI can be it's argued that emotion AI can be sort of assistive technology here itself, because actually it can help children with autism to communicate emotionally easier. So just to give another example to that, if that's okay. And so yeah, a lot of things, but a lot of examples. To answer your question, definitely not that it shouldn't be shared with anyone, but we should definitely bear in mind that if data protection laws are in place, if, for instance, the fairness principle, what does the fairness principle mean? There are like a lot of definitions, and definitely not in the context of data protection law, not a definite answer to that. But one of the main focuses of fairness principle is balancing different rights. So a child, a person, different freedom of expression, right to education, we talked about, right to data protection, right to privacy. They're very much linked, but not the same things. So, so all these things need to be balanced first before we decide to process. Sharing is a form of processing as well. So process a child's or a person's data. So I don't think there is like a definite answer to that. It cannot be. And this is the point, one of the points that I want to make here as well, in the context of fairness as well. Fairness is very conceptual. it depends on the context. As in the value-sensitive design, we see how values are perceived. The research shows that actually a universal design can be quite discriminatory as well, because one model doesn't fit, everyone. So that's certain. And all the things that we have been talking about, that I've been discussing today, maybe too much focusing on children with learning disabilities. Actually, I think it's just the main point that I really, really want to make is that they're different, and there are other different groups as well. And a universal approach wouldn't work for that. So today we can't come up with a definition, or maybe we can, but it should be a little bit abstract, as fairness, the concept of fairness is, to be able to cater the needs of all children, all groups, all people, like everyone. And it would be, I think, quite maybe bold and wrong to say that data shouldn't be, shouldn't be shared, because data should be shared so that innovation could happen, innovation could take place. I'm a privacy lawyer myself, but I very much defend that, if the data protection are in place, if the technical people understand what those data protection principles are, what the rights are, if for example, a DPIA, data protection impact assessment, is carried out, or children's rights impact assessment carried out. So if these are in place, if these are carried out, then yes, if it's for the best interest of the child, which is another topic that is currently being discussed in the UK with the recent the code, age appropriate design code, that came into force last year. So best interest of the child then should be shared, but it should be very much, it should be compliant with the laws. That this is for sure. And I think to your question, the autonomy of the child and what child thinks, actually, that's very important. And not many people seems to be asking about that. So how a child feels about sharing, when he or she hears about data is being shared about him or her. So that's a big question as well. And when we think about fairness, we should definitely think about and talk about participatory design, and actually including data subjects themselves in the design processes, and when making decisions about actually that would affect their lives. So this is why actually an approach, I as a lawyer, as someone coming from a legal background, I very, very much enjoy and learn a lot talking to people from other backgrounds. And I sometimes like, wow, it's just, I'm wrong, or I didn't think about that. But when in the context of fairness, when we all come together and include children or vulnerable data subjects themselves, I think this is only when a definite answer, if it could ever happen, we could have that about sharing data, how to apply fairness about that. It's not about a group of people and experts like the lawyers or, only legal people coming there, this should apply, this is the right way. This is not working. It's not working. The China example you gave, the surveillance technologies are being used. Things could start with education, with good intentions, but then it could become, it could come out of hands, definitely. So I think we should be very, very careful about that. And this is why also it's very important to talk about fairness and what it can mean.
I was going to ask you about that. That's a term that you frequently use, but it may have a technical meaning that we don't understand. So what does fairness mean in this context?
Well, there's the fairness definition to fairness. There is no single definition. There's no definition to fairness, actually. And in data protection law, fairness is being used with transparency and lawfulness in the GDPR in Article 5. And actually, this is one of the main reasons maybe why I'm doing my PhD on fairness as well, because there's a huge gap on what it means in the context of data protection. But what we know is, which is good, we know some things about fairness, especially in today's discussion. I think that this is the most relevant one. It's about balancing rights. It's about the reasonable expectations of a data subject. So it wouldn't be fair, for instance, if an organization is collecting data when I'm using a technology and use that data in so many different ways that could affect me, and I didn't know these things. That's not a fair application to tell it very, 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 simply, I'm saying. But balancing rights as well. Fairness principle is about balancing different rights and freedoms. And it's not only about data protection, it is in a data protection law. And it is something that everyone is talking about, fairness, but especially in the context of AI, we always link it to bias. And it's very normal, but actually data protection law, the fairness principle is more than bias. So looking deep down to, so where does bias come from? When, for example, we are conducting our research currently, the UN and gender stereotypes, we are looking there, and the use of AI actually in Central Asian countries, Western Balkans, Turkey as well. And one of the things that we really want to mention, and we will, is the gender stereotypes, or the stereotypes that are deeply rooted in the society itself. And so it's a huge thing. When we look at the case law, the laws, everything, and there are a lot of things to solve there at that level before we talk about technology. But it could be very, very helpful to come together from interdisciplinary, we always talk about that, and actually then talk about basic human rights. I know it sounds very cliche, very like, yeah, okay, we are talking about human rights, but how to balance rights. But if we can't do this, the fairness principle, the fairness wouldn't work, which is like the essence of the data protection law. So to briefly sum up, as I said, there is no single definition to fairness whatsoever, but we could say that, so one of the main points is balancing different rights and interests of data subjects. This is what it comes with fairness. Yeah, and it's very much linked to lawfulness and transparency. So for example, the first example I gave is very much linked to transparency. So you need to be transparent. If a data subject doesn't know, wouldn't reasonably expect what is being done with his or her data, then that wouldn't be transparent, and that wouldn't also be fair. Yes. I'm not sure if I confuse you more.
No. I think it makes sense, and I think here at the KUIS AI Center, we're all for human rights. So I think that was
I know that's so great. And also just one thing, Hocam, that I just remembered. This is also where you're using cards and making things simple actually for technical people themselves. So it's a human-computer interaction, in value sensitive design. This is why we are talking about these things too, because we need to translate what the law says into practice. And to do that, even like most of the people come from legal background, I don't think things are even clear for all of us. So it is very helpful to use VSD, value sensitive design methodology or tools to actually answer, for example, when like the question that you asked about fairness. So how we could do this in a way so that we make it simple, so that technical people can understand or can have a how do I say, more practical sense of what these principles, what these rules actually mean in practice. Because if we don't do that, we can talk about human rights, for hours, but then, but what happens after that? So who translates this into practice? Like who develops technology, who just, like who works on the other side? So that's very important. And the translation is very hard, but it can only work with, by having a common language. So huge thanks for raising that definition issue. Which is a great importance, I think.
Okay, I'm going to say one more thing and then I'm going to shut up. I want to leave a healthy amount of time for discussion. So if we can, let's say, finish in the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. That would be great.
Okay, then, Hocam. Yes, sure. Thank you. Sorry, did you say that you have a question? No. No,
not currently.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, actually answering your questions, I think I made the point that I really want to make about value sensitive design and also fairness. But let me briefly, if it's okay, talk about what value sensitive design and actually how why it is that relevant, why it is that important to talk about it in this context. So value sensitive design is not in the law, is not nothing to do with law, but it has a lot of things to do with as I mentioned, the balancing different rights. For instance, different rights and freedoms, and for that rights are rights, but how they're applied and the context, the culture, the location, situation of, or like any details actually about a person who wants to exercise his rights and freedoms. Things change, because when we look at like values as well, like moral values especially, we all know that there are, although like rights are fundamental, rights are universal, when we look at values, actually they depend on like culture to culture, like even like person to person. So this is very, very much important. And why it is very is of great importance is that when you ask me, for instance, about like fairness, I also said that that's contextual as well. Fairness is contextual as well, and this is why one of the reasons why it's very complex, and there are still a lot of questions. And value-sensitive design is an established method for integrating values into technical design. So when we talk about fairness, purpose limitation, let's say data minimization, all the principles, maybe some of you, or maybe all of you know, so there is a principle, there's a rule called data protection by design and by default, and that requires controllers to take the data protection principles, rules, and individual rights that are in the GDPR not into consideration, actually apply them into practice. So we are trying to understand fairness, but actually the law wants us to understand the fairness and then apply it in practice into the design processes. So that's a hugely challenging issue. But this is what is required in the law. And to be able to do that, as I said, we need to understand that what it is, and then find a technical solution to, okay, now we can reflect it, we can translate this into design, into the the practice side. So this value sensitive design, and already existing a great method, actually has been trying to do this for years now. And this is why I think it's hugely important to bring that together with the data protection by design and by default approach and the fairness principle. And maybe the value sensitive design in the HCI field could inform data protection law, or vice versa. The law could inform value sensitive design in the HCI field, because there are a lot of questions there too. So because we want to integrate values, as I said, rights into technical design. And there has been different methodologies, and more recently, especially in the context of AI, and there are a lot of arguments stating that AI poses a lot of challenges specifically to value sensitive design that require a different approach to be taken. And these challenges are usually mostly actually about the universal approach I talked about today, generalizing things, putting things into box, but there are different layers of vulnerabilities for different groups of people. So we need to take all these into account before we come up with a solution, or let's say a formula on how to translate things. And to be able to do that, I think my last point that I think mentioned previously is that we need to find a common language together and to common understanding, so that different groups of people could have the same understanding, especially about rights as well, so that then after understanding what balancing rights mean, after understanding the impact of AI-driven technologies, or like any technology actually could have on people, after doing that data protection impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, the impact assessment in overall, then we can try to apply fairness into practice. And the value sensitive design approach is definitely worth looking at, because as I said, they are the method there is about integrating values into technical design. So I think, sorry if I went over over my time.
This was perfect.
Okay, yeah. Any questions that you might have? And sorry if I was too legal to, so any questions that you might have, I will be very happy to answer them as well.
I want to open the floor for discussion as well. Anybody have any questions or comments, please?
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, my name is Ali Safa. I'm a CS PhD student working with Deniz Hoca. So basically my question is, like, as an, let's say, AI practitioner, what should I care about? This is the first question. And the second one is, when should I say, okay, so there is a problem here, I should stop and take let's say an advisement from a legal advisement? What is the suspicious things that I should stop and think about?
Great questions, and very, very practical questions, definitely. So when you say just one question about your second question, when you say like suspicious points, could you maybe I don't know, give an example or elaborate a little bit more on that question, so that I don't answer it to a completely different thing that I have in my mind, just to make sure.
Yeah, right. So let me give an example. Right now, I'm working on the NLP side, which is natural language processing. We work with mainly text. So let's say I developed a model that classifies tweets into offensive versus non-offensive tweets. Okay, and and I know that the data set is not created by me. It is created by some researchers who report their annotation quality, etc., and how they collected the data. And I developed a model and shared it. So how should I how should I should I care about the model usages by other companies or other parties, let's say?
Okay, so just to make sure, so I'm going to answer in terms of data processing and data protection law. This is what you want to know, right?
Yeah.
Whether, okay, great. Are you, so the first question is always, I'm sure you're asking, is whether you are, processing personal data. And actually, maybe before I answer to the second one, let me answer the first one, which was great. So you said that what should I care about? What should I be looking into, right? So it's about rights, I would say, and data protection impact assessment. So, and to your question, you said when, at what stage I should consult, someone from legal background before you start. This is what the law wants, because data protection impact assessment is about that itself. So first, before we start anything, to do anything, we should think about how it could impact people who are going to use it, or if it will have an impact on in other contexts as well. So data protection impact assessment is about that. And of course, you don't have to do data protection impact assessment for everything. But if you know that, if you're aware of that, there's a list that you could easily find, and I'm sure your legal colleagues could send them to you as well. So if you're aware that it's, for example, just one example that we've been discussing today, it can be used by vulnerable groups, or in somewhat, maybe it's not aimed for them, but still it could be reached out, for example, accessed by them in reasonable terms, then definitely a GPIA is required. But before starting anything, just to make sure that processing data requires compliance with data protection principles. Let's say that. And one of the principles was fairness. Today we talked about that. And that's about balancing different rights, thinking about how a person can be affected if that data processing is fair or not. Fairness, there's no definition. You could ask what fair means. Well, there's no one single definition for it. There are a lot of things, but we know that it's about balancing rights. So I would say, think about what rights of people could be affected, or what impact does processing data with this type that is something that you're developing could have on people. So this is the definitely first thing that you could think about. And it's very normal that, by the way, you can't have an answer to all these. This is why I think a legal person, someone from coming a legal background could ask you the, for example, when you were speaking, I have questions in my mind that I could ask, they could ask you, and maybe, then you could figure it out if, an adverse impact or an impact that you should take into account, or maybe some processing data should take place. So everything starts with asking, I think, first, of course, whether you're processing personal data. Even if you're not processing personal data, because now, when I say you, by the way, it's not you, it's any organization, anyone. We see that many organizations, especially like companies, claiming that they process anonymized data, and therefore, they don't have to comply with the law, with the GDPR. Well, research actually have shown that no, this is wrong. But if, and I'm not a technical person, but if appropriate safeguards are in place and really identifying a person is not possible in any way, well, of course that could, this is why actually it's outside of the scope of the GDPR itself. But if not, then the second question would be about rights. How, if this could affect any rights, anything that I should care about. So to your question about at what stage, what before starting and throughout the process, because as far as I know, I'm not a technical person, but things change. You can find new things, you can want to change something, on the way, your research and the technology you're developing. So if so during the process as well, if something significant changes, definitely I would consult someone as well. And yeah, I'm not sure if did I answer your questions? Anything that you want to ask?
Yeah, sure. That answer. Yeah, I mean, the answer is to before starting anything, think about it.
Yes, and during the process as well. It's not because things change. And also, just another thing, actually, your question is what we are is about what we are talking today. And you said, so what should I be careful for? I'm saying rights, but what does that mean? That's a big question. That's a $1 million question. This is what we are talking about this today. And this is why actually value-sensitive design is hugely important, because it's simply, well, at least a part of it tries to simplify things and translate things, in the technical process as well. So yeah, so I hope I question. Thank you.
I just wanted to add sort of one thing about the researcher's perspective that makes this your answer difficult in practice, Ayça. So as researchers, for example, when you talked about helping autistic people by detecting their emotions, etc. The first thing I think about is not who's going to use this technology to abuse who. The first thing I think about is, how can I actually get the image from the camera and assess, somebody's emotions, or, whether somebody is paying attention. That's a very interesting technical problem. Let me look at this. Let me collect some data and build a model, and let me do better than my competitors. That's all I care about. And I can say, most of the people at the AI lab are likewise. We don't necessarily project in the long run what this is going to be used for. We just see a challenging technical problem, and we're tool builders. And if there is no such tool, we're very excited to jump and build that tool. I mean, we just had a meeting today with Basit, John Berg's friend, and we're working on a model there where I can ask, here is a picture of Ayça, and show me what she would look like if she was blonde, or show me what she would look like if she was a man with a beard. And this thing actually creates amazing transformations, and we're having a lot of fun developing this technology. But I don't think we've spent more than 5 minutes thinking about in what ways can this technology be used or abused, right?
So, John, this is, sorry for interrupting, such a great point. And I realized that actually just listening to your question, I should make this very much clear. It's when we talk about rights, it's it's not only, I know that right now, when everyone is talking about harms, risks. Yes, there are risks, there are harms, but this is also why we have data protection laws there. So if, the NP and also experts like you, the technical side is on your side. So keeping the information secure, blah, blah, the technical, that's a part of data protection law as well. So actually being compliant with data protection law takes that as well, and it's very important. But about the point you mentioned, this is about rights as well. For example, if someone is developing a technology and of course needs data for that, as you said, and it will in the end benefit actually people. So the right to privacy, right to data protection should never ever hinder another right. And actually, if people are going to benefit from that technology, so that's a very good reason, and especially in the context of research. My answer was especially when I was answering, mostly I thought about, and I think I said that about like companies as well, private companies as well. But in the research, good things will happen because you are doing this research, and data protection is not. This is a very much wrong, I think, misunderstood thing in general. With data protection laws, oh no, we shouldn't process data. Maybe we should. No, like this is not about it. When I say balancing rights, it's about thinking about research, about public good, public interest. So things are there too. And if vulnerable people are involved, you should definitely, I think, start from the beginning, but not in everything, of course. And especially in the context of research, this is great. Without processing data, without collecting data, nothing is almost like possible. So and I think people who are really data protection experts and really know data protection would probably tell you that as well. And no one will say probably, no, stop using processing data. But huge thanks for mentioning that as well, because as I said, there's a huge misunderstanding about that. And more than 5 minutes might not be necessary as well, depending on the context. So there's nothing wrong here.
So, okay. So let's say, I think there's two different concepts here that are sort of fighting in my head. One is data protection, which we all understand, but the other one is also misuse of technology, right? So the concepts of bias and fairness comes into the picture there. So you create some technology and some judge uses it to determine the guilt or innocence of a person or something, and then real effects actually happen in real life, which possibly this technology wasn't sufficient or intended for. So that requires a technologist, or I'm not sure if we can, but to think about possible uses of the tools that we create, or misuses, and that's a very difficult problem, right? So you can create a tool with very best of intentions, and still some people will find ways to use them in horrible ways. So what is your general view on that?
I completely agree with you. There are, the intentions, the purposes might be very good, but actually it could end up in, being used bad. So there is no single answer to that, but I completely agree with you. It's a very complex question depending on the context, but at least if we have, data protection, if we have robust data protection laws, and if we have a good understanding, and I'm underscoring the importance of, data protection laws doesn't mean stop processing data. This is not it. It's like processing data, doing things, but compliance with the law. I know that there's a very rigid understanding of it as well, but this is not about that. So my general view is that, well, I can't think of a way to prevent that. So we are all humans, and things can happen. But at least if you raise awareness, if we think about some general stuff, like we talked about today, and be careful about with who we share, our findings, the data, I think that's what's important. And transparency is key here, of course, because things could be solved as if you know, like at some level at least, if we know what's going on. But if no one knows what's, you know, going on, especially looking from an individual rights, let's say, perspective, that would be even more wrong. And so, yeah, it's about being informed about how data is processed, what's going on, and whatsoever, so that if something bad happens, hopefully, transparency even could be helpful there as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think transparency is key in preventing misuse, because in almost all the cases I've read about bad decisions, bias, etc., there was always a black box that is providing the decisions, and that black box was not analyzed by experts who could criticize the decision-making process. So I think it's very important. If some machine is going to make a decision that affects your life, then you should have the right to understand how that machine is working.
Definitely, and as long as this is aligned with transparency and fairness principles as well. So yeah, we are definitely up for transparency. Thank you, Deniz Hocam, for your comment.
All right. Any other questions? Leyla Hocam, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. And the last point will be accountability. You mentioned two important principles, which is transparency and yes. So what about, what do you think about accountability, which is one of the key principles of AI systems?
Leyla Hocam, huge thanks for this great point. Of course, accountability, transparency, fairness, accountability, our 3 stars, I think is of course very important. And just to link it to the data protection, I talked about data protection by default and by design, for instance, there. So that's Article 25. That's also in that principle, that article is also about accountability, because it wants you to show fairness, transparency, all the rules, all the rights that are, you know, like in the law, for instance, but it requires controllers, it requires organizations to be able to show that, to be able to not be able to respect actually people's right to data protection and comply with the rules. So I think, well, in our context, not in general, accountability is definitely hugely important. But in terms of our discussion today, I think a great importance should be given to data protection by design and by default, to look at that and think about the questions, okay, then how I could translate this into practice, how I could, you know, be more transparent, like not be transparent, aligned in compliance with the law, etc. And in that principle as well, there are bets on rights. So make sure that individuals can exercise their rights. When I say rights, it's you know, for example, right to be forgotten, let's say, or right of access, so accessing your data. So like things like that is hugely important for many reasons, starting from autonomy to anything related to data protection and rights. I think, Leyla, many thanks for your comment and question.
Thank you so much, Ayça.
And that sort of brings us to the end of our hour. So I would like to thank our guest Ayça for a very informative discussion. And you know, we hope to keep in touch with you in going forward, and looking forward to the results of your research.
Thank you, Deniz Hocam. Thank you very much for inviting me and your great points, questions, and yes, being here.
I'm also happy New Year to everyone.
I was just going to say that, and wishing you everyone a happy New Year.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.